This is Reframe, the podcast from the College of Education, Health, and Society on the campus of Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. School mascots bring entertainment and excitement to so many sports. They can create a shared sense of identity and even foster a deep sense of community among fans. But some school mascots have also been called into question, especially those that can be seen as stereotypical or insensitive to various cultural subgroups. This is often a complex issue that continues to spark conversations, and it's just made new headlines in schools in Idaho, Wisconsin, Maine, Florida, and California. Here in Oxford, Ohio, this issue is also recently at the center of a very passionate debate around the use of a Native American mascot for the local Talawanda school district. And the story that followed became a fascinating story that touches upon aspects of moral psychology, the importance of local politics, and even the ways in which other schools may choose to navigate similar challenges. So today on the podcast, I want to welcome Dr. Sam Morris. He's a Miami University clinical professor of sport leadership and management, and he wrote the report in favor of dropping the Talawanda Native American mascot and changing the school's nickname. So Dr. Morris, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to begin by getting some background on this issue and on the mascot change. It really seems to have sparked a lot of engagement from a lot of people, especially those who are very passionate on both sides of the issue. So what was the genesis of this long debate and the mascot change, and where does this story really begin for anyone who is unfamiliar with what happened?
Yeah, well, you're right about it sparking passion. If you went to the school board meetings, enrollment was way up there for a brief window of time for several months, and then once the issue was settled, enrollment kind of went back down. So the history of the issue, it kind of goes back a long way. So back in the 1950s, I'm a local guy. I'm from here. I went to Talawanda High School and strangely ended up right back here as a faculty member. So I've kind of lived through, at least in my lifetime, a lot of it. But back in the 1950s, the local school districts all consolidated into what's now the Talawanda School District. And so there's always been a kind of a tension between the townships and the city with regards to the school district. And that sets the context in which some of this argument unfolds. But it really picks up last fall, about a year ago. So that would have been the fall of 2018. I actually read in the Oxford Observer that the school district was going to reconsider the mascot because they'd been under some pressure. We've had some students express concerns about it. There were some implications about bullying. Some people lose sight of the fact that I don't think people always appreciate the fact that Native Americans still live here and in the community. And so their kids attend our schools, and it's, they're fully embedded and entrenched just as anyone else is. And so there were some issues cropping up around that, and the school board decided to revisit the issue. It's the fourth or fifth time that they've considered changing it. So it's not new, but it just kind of came back up again over some issues that had gone on in the school district. And so they convened a committee with a new superintendent and decided to revisit it. So I reached out to the school as an alum, as a local faculty member here. I've written about it. I published an article about this in an academic journal years ago, so I was pretty well informed on the issue. And so I did. I asked if I could join the committee, and they were looking for balance. They wanted some folks who they thought would be eager to change. They wanted some folks who they thought would be eager to stay the same. And they wanted some folks who were undecided. And so that's how I got involved. That's how I got looped into it.
How did they respond to the fact that you are an academic who had already researched this, and how did your research fit into the conversation?
I don't think most people knew that. When I came in for the first committee meetings, we're all introducing ourselves, and the way that my identity was framed, and it was first and foremost as an alum of the school. I'd been a student athlete as well. I'd played on the football and baseball team and had some success with that, and so that was a big part of it. And I was eager. There's also some what local folks call town and gown tension. Mm-hmm. And so I was eager not to be perceived as someone who was coming from the university to tell the high school how they should do things, because that's just presumptuous and condescending, and people in the community don't like it. Well, it's not necessarily that, but that's how it's perceived sometimes. So I was careful not to overplay the role of my identity that was an academic. But at the same time, I had written about it. I have careful and considered views about it that had gone through the peer review process, and so that indicates some degree of serious thinking on the topic. So only once the kind of committee got rolling and we were having discussions about, well, what does the research say here, did that part of who I am kind of get pulled in? Because it's inevitable at that point. I'm not going to sit there and not mention that I happen to know all the peer-reviewed research on this.
Right.
So that's how that kind of came through. I had written a paper called The Trouble with Mascots. Simple title. The Trouble with Mascots. And I had argued in that paper that the issue was ultimately about stereotyping, because that's what mascots do. They're meant to be representative. They're proxies. They're a stand-in for some virtue that you want to convey. So the issue to me was not necessarily whether it was a positive or a negative connotation. It was just that it was a connotation. It was just a stereotype. And so that's fine if you want to stereotype the Panthers or the Cougars or the Tigers or whatever, because it's different notions of doing harm. But in this case, you're talking about distinct ethnic groups of people who have a particular history that is not exactly something that we should be proud of, at least European Native American history. Most people know that story, so I don't need to get into those details. So it's different when you're stereotyping an ethnic group, particularly an ethnic group that's been treated the way that those groups have been historically. So that's what makes the stereotyping a bit different for me. So I argued in that paper, the real trouble here is that we're stereotyping distinct ethnic groups of people, and no school board would be proud of that, right? That's not something I don't think a public school would want to convey to their students, that you ought to be stereotyping people. In some sense, it's a part of human nature. We do it because we pick up on patterns. It's just the way our brains work. But in some sense, that's kind of a glitch in the human psyche, not necessarily a feature of it. So we need to be aware of the fact that we stereotype and account for it. And so in that paper, I had argued that part of the trouble is that we're stereotyping those groups of people, and we probably shouldn't be doing that.
So I think really quickly we can talk ultimately about what did happen. So the name was officially changed. It went from the Talawanda Braves to the Talawanda Brave.
Yeah.
So that S was dropped. And then the school will no longer purchase or sell apparel and equipment with that Native American head logo. So when you were thinking about the final changes that you did want to see happen, were there originally more significant changes that were discussed and you decided on dropping the S because that maybe was seen as the most feasible or realistic compromise that could actually be achieved? Or what was that initial strategic planning process like?
Yeah. So to speak of the plan is kind of strange because it's a fairly organic process. And because we had about 15 or so people on the committee, some of us were pulling the rope one way and some of us were pulling the rope the other way. So it's not exactly like a cohesive plan. But there were definitely people sort of drew alliances within, and the folks who were pulling the same way did strategize about what kind of plan there might be. But the whole committee, to their credit, people on both sides of the issue, did end up putting up several possible solutions to the problem, and they included wholesale change. So this committee will convene, we'll recommend a change, and we'll produce 3 or 4 viable options. Maybe we can become, at one point we had suggested the idea of the Talawanda Tigers, which references back to the pre-school district merger, because before the merger there was Stewart here in town and they were the Stewart Tigers. So many people thought like it's an ode to our history and lineage. We'll go back to that name. So anyway, one of our options was wholesale change, new mascot, everything. A second option was recommend wholesale change, but don't make any explicit recommendations about what. So we just say to the school board, dump the Braves mascot and all of that and find something new. Whatever you want new, it's up to you. So we didn't, we were a little bit less assertive there. The third option was the status quo, just leave everything the way it is. The fourth option was to just eliminate the Native American silhouette, keep the Braves, but just drop the Native American imagery that was associated with it, and then just become the Talawanda Brave, which, as you know, is ultimately what happened. Ultimately, that's where we sorted out, was on to drop the S, because pragmatically, the folks who were pushing for a change saw that as the most feasible sell.
Now, what about those on the other side? I mean, aside from just keeping the status quo or making no change, what was the viewpoint of those who were opposed?
It boiled down to a question of perception, intent versus perception. So the argument always has been that this is meant to be honorable. It's meant to be something to be proud of. We're holding up this culture of people. But, again, the language isn't precise here. People forget that, you can't just broadly speak of Native Americans. There are hundreds and hundreds of Native nations. I mean, they're very different and diverse within themselves. So it's very weird to say like Native American culture when that's not some cleanly unified thing. Like there's a diaspora there. But anyway, so the argument was it's meant to represent sort of pride, honor, dignity, respect, bravery, and so forth. Which again, because the logo is a proxy, it's quite strange that you would imbue so much value into that mark when very clearly it's very clear what you intrinsically care about is the virtue of bravery. And so in some sense, you're really not going to lose anything if you take this mark away and put that mark in, because the core thing that you care about is still there. Bravery, courage, all that sort of stuff. And so that was the argument from the other side, was tradition. This has always been a tradition. But the idea was that it was intended to be an honor. And of course, the tension is intent and perception is not always the same.
Was what you proposed, was that ultimately controversial? Did it raise more contention than you expected it to? Because it seems like a perfect compromise. Like you get to maintain the core of it, even with regards to the meaning, and then the literal word itself is mostly still there.
Yeah. It didn't surprise me that it was still contentious and controversial, only because I knew, you need to know a good deal about moral psychology, about how people think about ethical decisions, because this is kind of a moral issue. And I've read some of the research on that. There's some very good work on it. And I know that once people commit, it's very hard to persuade them, and any change is unacceptable. So while it does, when we drafted that particular part of the proposal, let's just drop the S, we'll become the Talawanda Brave. It's very minimal rebranding from an economic perspective, right? There's not a lot of changes you have to make. And we had a very clear plan about how to do that, about phasing everything out. It's not some instantaneous wholesale change that's going to cost tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's a phase out. But even so, it's a very small change, Braves to Brave. And if anything, you're just eliminating things that you buy, right? You're eliminating the Native American Indian head, you're eliminating the S, you're reducing those things. So it seems like a no-brainer, right? That you can retain the core thing and the transition cost is minimal. But change is change. And I just knew that, I think we all knew that people were just going to fight like hell to keep it, because it's the thing that they love.
One of the things that you did touch on there very briefly that I wanted to come back to, which was one of the main arguments from the opposing view, those in favor of keeping the name and mascot, was the cost associated there. And I think one of their leading arguments that I read about was especially how that could relate to things like the turf, which I think was up to $450,000. That's how much it could potentially cost to replace that. But then immediately you already had an answer for that, like right away, which I thought was great.
Yeah, I thought, that I get that. Of course, it's right to be concerned about the cost. It's a public school district. Things are expensive. Athletics are a high priority, but they're not the highest priority. It's a public school. And so people are right to be concerned about the cost. I think that's fair and right. But at the same time, as you said, we thought of that and we had a very clear plan about that. Frankly, it was a red herring. I think folks who wanted to keep the mascot the way it was knew that if they riled up the base about this being very expensive, they'd fight like crazy to keep it, whether or not that was true. And it was quite strange, the night of the board meeting when we took the vote, at one point, it was strange because prior to our committee presenting, the athletic director stood up, and one of the things that he said, so he gave his annual report essentially to the board at the board meeting, in the public session that is, about where things stood. And one of the things he said was, we're hitting, I forget what it was, X year with the field turf, so it's due to be replaced in a year or two. So here he is standing there saying very literally to the entire group of people, we're going to change this soon, regardless of what we change it to. If it stays the Talawanda Braves, it's still going to be replaced in a year. Right. And then the very next thing is our committee comes up and says, it's going to cost us $1 million to change this field. And I kind of want to say, you're already committed to that, right? That's no new money. But that there's something about that sound of hearing you're going to spend this much money on this thing, regardless of the fact that it was already laid out in the budget. It just riled people up. And the other thing that got pointed out in that meeting was that there was a school in Oregon that made a bunch of changes. And so we reached out to them and they detailed a lot of expenses and costs that they had in transitioning away from there. It was the same thing, by the way. They were the Braves and they switched to the Brave. So they made the same change we did. And they talked about all the expenses that they incurred. What didn't get mentioned, at least not until I went up and spoke, was the state of Oregon passed legislation to require that. So essentially they were doing it under prescription. They were being told, you have to do this. And yet they had a certain timeline they had to do it in, so they did have to make a wholesale change. And of course, that's fundamentally dissimilar to the situation we were in. We were under no one's pressure. We're doing this on our own timeline, on our own will, on our own budget. So that pressure of change now and change everything at a high cost simply didn't apply to us. But nonetheless, it got, it's in the official minutes of the meetings because that's a scary thing to hear, and it makes people say, no, I don't want to do that.
Did you look at other schools besides Oregon to get examples of what other schools have done that worked and maybe things they've done that didn't work?
Yeah. We looked around. Most of the I mean, so of course you have popular media stuff about how that has gone on. Most of what I know is the academic literature, and most of that is on colleges and universities. So it's not a great comparison because it's really not apples to apples there. Things get pretty different pretty quickly. So it's not all that helpful. And even within that research, if I recall, it's pretty mixed. So yeah, there are costs and benefits and successes and failures in that transition. And we did look at some other schools that had done it. But it's really hard to make good comparisons at the high school level. I mean, that was the flaw with bringing up the Oregon school, was it's not a good comparison. Contextually, it's just very different. What they had to do and what we were considering were not that similar despite first appearances.
Yeah, for something that seems so similar on the surface, that's interesting. How did the Native American population here perceive this issue? What were their opinions on the proposed change?
So the Native American folks who were in the community came out. They came to the school board meetings. They gave eloquent talks because there's open forum where you can speak. And I mean, some of them I know. I won't necessarily name drop because maybe they don't want to have their names. They probably want to get away from it, frankly. But anyway, a lot of them came and made pretty eloquent statements about why they thought it should be changed. What I didn't hear at any point was anyone from those communities arguing in defense of keeping it. Now, the folks on the other side did bring in a man from Illinois who claimed to have Native American heritage, who argued that we should keep it. That was not well received. It was quite controversial. He was added to the agenda through uncertain means, like it was kind of unclear how he got there and why he was coming from Illinois. And so that didn't go over very well. But the folks within the community who went and mostly spoke out against it impassionedly, and I thought they did those comments were pretty eloquent. Strangely, at one point I heard someone from the local community, a Native American, who spoke out against it, and then the next person who spoke took the microphone and essentially said, "I've never heard anyone complain about this." And it was just flooring to me in that moment to see, like, that's literally the last thing you heard. The last word spoken was a Native American lamenting this. And you followed it with, "I've never heard anyone speak against this." And I just thought, I mean, when you speak in a public forum, you get nervous and you're not really listening to the people in front of you. But that contrast, like back to back, was really a striking thing to hear. So it was a lot of people talking past each other, frankly, because it's very hard to really listen in these forums for all of us. I mean, anybody.
So what kind of implications do you think this has for schools, locally, even nationally? Earlier you mentioned how it's hard to make comparisons with other high schools, but maybe this now could be an example or a roadmap for high schools who are planning on or who are forced to deal with similar issues. I don't know. Yeah,
it's interesting. So I used to work at the Ohio High School Athletic Association, and one of my former colleagues there, one of the things that he just put together, I think he just did it for fun, honestly. He put together a mascot database. So we have this big database of what every school in Ohio uses. And if you look at some of that data, there's other data too in addition to his. Ohio has one of the highest concentrations of this. Like, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I think we have more Native American high school mascots in Ohio than any other state in the union. It's like Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and then I think maybe Utah is right up there, which there's historical reasons why it's those states. But so far, we're only the second school in Ohio to change. Many schools have considered. Anderson, I know, had considered, Fairfield Indians are right down the road from here. There are an awful lot. And for the most part, I don't think there's the will to change because this is an ugly fight. It's very difficult. People get very emotional and very serious about it despite its sort of strangely inherent triviality. It's a pain. I mean, it's hard to do this. That doesn't mean it's not worth doing, but it's a hard thing to do. What you will notice, and this is one of the things I mentioned to that committee, you don't see anybody going the other way. Mm-hmm. Like nobody's dropping their, Mustang's mascot to become the Indians or the Braves or the Redskins or whatever. Nobody's going that way. Mm-hmm. And I think that's telling. I think that kind of reveals a lot about how things are going nationally. You do see a lot of colleges and universities transitioning. That list is probably longer. Of course, there's enormous pressure on the Washington Redskins because they have kind of the most overtly offensive marks and logos. Others seem to sort of, there's scrutiny everywhere. You can read popular media depictions and they say, well, why don't people criticize the Chiefs? They do. You just don't read it, evidently. The Chiefs get a lot of criticism, the Braves, the Indians, the Chicago Blackhawks. I mean, they all come in for the criticism on those images and marks. But again, it's complicated. There are a lot of stakeholders. There's a lot on the line, and it's hard to make changes like that. So I think you're more likely to see it at the high school level and then the college level, and even less likely at the professional level, personally.
I think that's a really good point. You don't see schools moving the other way.
Yeah.
It's generally always more towards that more progressive way of viewing things. And this issue continues to come up too. So, I mean, I mentioned even in the intro to this conversation, schools in 5 other states right now debating similar changes. So it seems like even if they don't want to make the change now, this may come to their doorstep at some point in time in the future.
Well, and that's something I mentioned in those board meetings was, we made the comparison to that school in Oregon, but they were under legal pressure to do it. And one of the biggest arguments against changing the mascot was this perception of the cost, which again, I thought was vastly overstated. But then I couldn't help but point out, like, if your concern is the cost, you should also be concerned about litigation. You should also be concerned about civil rights cases where folks in the community who have significant and probably real perceived and real harm from this, what if they sue you? I mean, you can't just make that go away. There's no magic wand. It is a legal liability to have that kind of mascot. Or if we end up in a situation, and I think politically Ohio is just not there. We're not Oregon, we're not Massachusetts, we're not Maine, I think, or some other states that have done this. But, maybe in the future Ohio says no more Native American mascots. That's going to cost us because now we are going to be under the gun. So in some sense, I try to tell that committee, like, let's just get ahead of that. Let's not wait till we get sued. Let's not wait till the state changes its laws. Let's do it on our own timeline, at our own cost, on our own budget, and our own pace. So I viewed that as definitely a positive reason for change, but I don't know how well that was perceived.
Well, I guess last question then, since you have been through this, what's some advice you would have for schools who want to make this change, who need to make this change?
Yeah, I think my advice would be to be very realistic about how difficult it's going to be. It is very difficult to wrap your head around how people are tied to these things, how emotionally caught up and bound in these marks and logos and images we are, and the way that we care about sports, which they are worth caring about. Sports are the kind of things that bring vivacity and richness and life and fun to our lives and in some ways make our lives worth living. I mean, they're an expression of human freedom and joy and fun. And so it's right to care about them. But you got to be careful that you don't attach too much of your caring to the wrong things sometimes. I realize that I'm presuming that that's the wrong thing there, but I think I'm right about that one. So part of my advice would be to just be realistic about how difficult it's going to be. And the other thing, and this is kind of this is not something I'm thrilled to admit. In many ways, I think we all knew that it was going to come down to the school board members, right? We had 5 school board members. The only people's opinions in that entire process who matter were those 5 people. Other opinions mattered, but they didn't count, if you catch my distinction there. They mattered, but they didn't count. Mm-hmm. Those 5 people, their opinions counted. And right from the beginning, I approached it, and I know everyone else on that committee did, politically, because it's a political process. And when you're thinking politically, you're wondering who you can predict and who you can't. And I knew that there were at least 4 people of the 5 who I could predict. I knew that those 4 people were not going anywhere on their views. Well, I guess I didn't know that, but I was very confident, let's put it that way. And then there was a 5th who I had a pretty good indication. I think we all could have guessed, but we were much less certain. And so in some ways, all the work we did was for the swing vote. We're all working toward the swing vote. And again, knowing what I know about moral psychology and how resistant people are to changing their ideas and the way they think, I knew it was going to be hard to move somebody on this. And despite knowing all that, there was some more information that I just knew. I knew I had to get the answer. I didn't want it, but I asked for a meeting. When all the dust settled and the vote was done, I asked for a meeting with the swing vote. And so we talked. We sat down. We talked for about 90 minutes. And at the end of it, I said, did any of our work have anything to do with your decision? Had you made your mind up before we started? Did we really influence you at all? And I knew what he was going to say. And he said no. And so in some sense, it's like, we didn't do anything. We didn't do anything. Those 5 people had made their minds up before. I'm not 100% convinced of that. I think sometimes when you lay out the reasoning and the rationale, sometimes it does confirm your intuition, and that's a good thing. But it's really hard when you lay out the reasons and rationale and it doesn't confirm your intuition. That's when it's hard to change your mind. So I was a little bit sad to hear that we really hadn't moved the people on the board, but that's not to say it wasn't worth the effort. And that's what I mean. Like, if you want to go into something like that, you need to appreciate how hard it's going to be to make a difference. But that's kind of like, that's a perennial problem with everything. How do you go about tackling a problem not knowing whether you can make a difference? You never know until you go in. The only other thing that might be worth talking about is the fallout, the reaction after the fact. I mean, you asked me about this a little bit, but I was curious to see. So, we had 5 members on the school board who ultimately, as I said, everyone's opinion mattered, but theirs counted. 3 of them, their terms were up on the school board, and only one of them is coming back. One of the folks who voted to change is not running to be reelected. And then another person who voted to keep it also is not running again, and I have no idea why they decided not to run again. But it's interesting, to say the least, that after this change, we now have possibly 60% of the school board turning over. And so as I'm kind of talking to people and listening about how the race for school board is going to go, not surprisingly, a lot of it is, there's people running on at least some part of their platform is, we're going to overturn this, because not a lot has been changed yet, as I said.
Is that possible?
It's certainly possible. I mean, if the school board goes a certain way, they could just as easily vote to go back to the Braves. They'd be the first school to ever go from not a Native American mascot to one. Well, not ever, but contemporarily, I mean. So that pending school board vote, I'll be curious to see, of the folks who are running for the 3 open seats, how many of them stake a part of their campaign to, I'm going to go back to the Braves, I'm going to bring this back. Because there are a certain contingency in the community who I know want that, because they perceive that because not much has happened yet, they could still claw it back possibly. That matters. Who's on the school board matters. Local politics matter, state politics matter, national politics matter. Politics matter in all this. And so who's on your local school board matters. Who's your board of trustees if you're a university? That matters on these decisions. So the people that you most often vote for those positions, your votes matter. So that's even though I didn't feel great that maybe we moved the committee, I do feel great that in some sense it's like politics still does work, for as dysfunctional as we like to think it often is. I mean, it's real. Your votes matter.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that's why this is really such an interesting story, because it's not just about the cultural implications and the changing cultural climate of schools making these progressive changes. I mean, it's also a really great example of what it's like to get involved in local community political life, in a real way, and how these things unfold. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's a fascinating subject, and it consumed a lot of my time last year, and I'll be curious to see how it unfolds over time.
Dr. Sam Morris is a clinical professor of sport leadership and management here at Miami University, and this is the Reframe podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with everyone, your friends, family, students. There's many more episodes available for free on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you so much for listening.